spectacular, this organization. All right, so we have a timely talk, and I am going to share screen, so give me a minute to do this. I'm sharing sound, and we've got this, and here we go. All right. Kol Nidre Anybody know who that is? Recognize that voice? And now something very I remember as a kid my mom wonderful Chazan Angela Buckdahl in New York. And if you go on the web, you can find dozens, if not hundreds, of renditions of Kol Nidre. What is it about Kol Nidre? Have you ever looked at the words? Is it a prayer? No, it's a legal document. We don't sign it, but we verbally swear to it. And yet, there is something about Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre may be the most recognized and most beloved of Jewish liturgical melodies. Is that only because of the Jews who come to shul only once a year? Where does this liturgy come from, and how did such a cold text in Aramaic yet, how did it come to be associated with such a warm melody? I mean, look at the lyrics. All vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges, and promises that we vow or promise to ourselves and to God from this day of atonement till to the next day of atonement, may it approach us for good, we hereby retract them. May they all be undone, repealed, canceled, voided, annulled, and regarded as neither valid nor binding. Our vows shall not be considered vows. Our renunciations shall not be considered renunciations, and our promises shall not be considered promises. That's a prayer. And would you trust anyone who once a year declared that their promises shall not be considered promises? And when did this strange text first appear in the synagogue? We think Kol Nidre was probably introduced into the liturgy by the Babylonian rabbi Yehudai Gaon in the middle of the 8th century. So it's been in our liturgy for about 1200 years, but not without controversy. The underlying principle of Kol Nidre is based on a passage in the Talmud. Anyone who desires that his vows not be upheld for the entire upcoming year should stand up at the beginning of the year and say, any vow that I take in the future should be void. And about 1100 years ago, probably about a century after Kol Nidre was instituted, another Babylonian rabbi, Amram Gaon, one of the greatest of his time, wrote that some Jews recite Kol Nidre, and he continues, but the Holy Academy renounced it as a foolish custom, and it is prohibited to recite it. He ruled that it should be eliminated from the liturgy. And another 9th century Babylonian rabbi, Natrai Gaon, wrote, "We have already expressed our opinion and explained that we should not say Kol Nidre at all. There is no basis for the custom." So what's the problem? Our text, like the Talmudic dictum, refers to vows that might be made in the coming year. Miyom Kippurim zeh ad Yom Kippurim haba. And for centuries, anti-Semites have pointed to Kol Nidre as evidence that Jews cannot be trusted, since through this formula they can invalidate their promises. In the Middle Ages, Jews even had to take a special oath when testifying in a court of law. And of course, this is based on a false understanding. Kol Nidre actually deals only with vows made between humans and God, not person-to-person business deals. But still, in the early 19th century, the Reform movement tried to abolish Kol Nidre in an effort to eliminate irrational liturgy and in reaction to the anti-Semitic accusations. But by then, Kol Nidre, with its haunting melody, had become the most powerful symbol of Yom Kippur. Reform Jews did not care what the words meant. They wanted Kol Nidre back, because there's something about Kol Nidre. But if it's not the text, it must be the melody. So where does our melody come from? Actually, we don't know. But here's the evidence that we do have. The oldest reference can be found in prayer books, Machzorim, of the 11th and 12th centuries, almost 1,000 years ago, which have explicit instructions that the Chazan must sing Kol Nidre in a specific manner and not improvise any way that he pleases. Here's a sentence from one of the very first high holiday prayer books, the Machzor Vitri, from the same time, around the year 1100. He, meaning the cantor, and of course in those days it was always he should approach with trepidation. At first, the cantor sings Kol Nidre with a very low voice, like a person hesitating to enter the palace of the king and to make a request. He is fearful of coming close, and he is whispering. The second time, he raises his voice somewhat. And the third time, he raises his voice more and more like a person who has become used to being among the royal retinue. In the 14th century, Rabbi Yaakov Merlin, the Maharil, wrote that the Chazan should extend the chant of Kol Nidre, Ya'arich bo benigunim, until nightfall. He also mentioned that it should be sung 3 times, getting progressively louder. Do you know why we start Kol Nidre before nightfall? We have to start Kol Nidre before Yom Kippur starts, because, as we said, Kol Nidre is a legal procedure, and legal annulment of vows may not be performed on Shabbat or holidays. Now, Rabbi Molin encouraged the stretching out of the prayer to make sure that even the latecomers would hear it. 300 years later, around the year 1600, Mordechai Yaffe of Prague speaks of a fixed melody. Kol Nidre sheminagenim bo achshav hachazanim. What does achshav mean? Kol Nidre, that now the cantors sing. So perhaps our melody that we know so well was new at that point, 300 years ago. Now keep in mind that while the musical notation system that we're familiar with had been developing since, the 13th century or so, it was known at first only to scholars in monasteries, and then spread throughout the population of Christian Europe. With a few notable exceptions, Jews did not read or write that kind of musical notation. Cantors learned their art by oral transmission. The first actual notation of our melody dates from 1765, and it is in the hand of Aharon Beer, cantor in Berlin. Other notations from the following decades are very similar, such as those of cantor Salomon Sulzer in Vienna, Louis Lewandowski in Berlin, Samuel Naumburg in Paris, and Abraham Beer in Sweden, notwithstanding few minor variations in details. So let's look at some of the memorable motifs in Kol Nidre, and feel free to sing along with me as long as your microphone is muted. Okay, we begin with the best known motif, this falling half step. Kol Nidre, and then it keeps falling. Vesare. And then this beautiful melody. Dim darna. And kulhon, which we hear again later on Nidrana. And then this lovely melody, Shevikin, Shevitin, Betelin Muvutalin. Notice how many of these seem to modulate from a minor key to a major key. And in fact, the final cadence, which we hear several times, does end us in major. It starts with a nigun of sorts. Which we hear again with Habalenu Litova, and at the very end, and I've changed keys to something a little bit more comfortable, Ushvuatana La Shavuot. Now, very similar to that last motif are these high holiday motifs. Eloheinu, Velohei Avoteinu. Or this one, Umavir Yom, Umevi Laila, Umavdil Ben Yom Uven Laila, Uranai Tzvaot Shemo, Elechai V'kayam. Or Yitkadal, V'yitkadash. And the special melody that is reserved for the high holidays, Aleinu L'shabeach, and here it comes, Ladon HaKol. So there it is, that recurring motif that sounds a little bit like a fanfare. So the Kol Nidre melody, as we say, starts in a minor key, but keeps modulating into the major. We might infer an exegetical interpretation that our yearning for expiation is fulfilled as the cadences where music shifts from minor to major. And this is reflected in the text. The music switches from minor to major on the words, as we saw, Haba aleinu l'tova, may it come to us for good. Haba aleinu l'tova. And ushvuatana la shavuot, may our vows be annulled. Ushvuatana la shavuot. Now, I have to say, minor keys are not necessarily sad, although they are often used, at least in Western music, to portray sadness. And the major key doesn't necessarily mean happy. But for most of us, a shift from minor to major seems like a shift from darkness to light. And that's actually based on the laws of physics and acoustics, that a major key, that major third, actually a major tenth, is a normal part of the acoustic overtones, but the minor seems to disappoint our expectation. Well, let's play a little musical geography. We're going to listen to how several communities chant the first phrases of Kol Nidre. You'll notice a few things. First of all, only the Ashkenazim have the melody that we think of as being so universal. Some communities rush through the text, treating it like the legal document that it actually is. In every case, you will hear how Jewish sacred music has been influenced by the music of the surrounding majority culture. First of all, here again is cantor Angela Buchdahl at the Central Synagogue in New York City singing our traditional Ashkenazic melody. You may have to turn up your volume for some of these, I'm sorry. That is so beautiful. Let's go to Afghanistan now. And let's see how Jews of Afghanistan have been chanting. I don't know how many are left, but how they would chant Kol Nidre.
Kol Nidre Vesare Ushboe Veniduye Baharame Beguname Begunahe Begunase.
Next, we go to Morocco.
Kol Nidre Vesare O Shivoe Venidoye Vaharame Vekonami Vekunahe Vekunase.
Were you all singing along? And one more. Yemenite Jews.
Kol Nidre wa Asore Ushvoe wa Nidduye wa Harome wa Gunnome wa Gunnohe wa Gunnose Dinadarna wa di Ishtavana wa di Naddina wa di Haramna.
You notice, of course, not only the difference in the music, but difference in the pronunciation of Hebrew. And sometimes the words, the order of the words is changed slightly. All right, let's go to Berlin. Louis Lewandowski was the choir master at the Oranienburger Straße synagogue in Berlin for most of the 19th century. It was a beautiful building. Here are some depictions of it before the Second World War. He presided over a majestic service in a synagogue that had seating for more than 3,000 with one of the finest organs in all of Berlin. In 1882, he published his arrangement of Kol Nidre for cantor, choir, and organ. It's pretty much the way we're used to hearing it today. Kol Nidre, Esare, Vacharome, Vikonome, Vichnuye, Vikinuse, Ushevus. But at the request of several less traditional synagogues, he also published 3 other versions. The inscription reads, "For the Jewish community of Munich, arranged after the melody of Kol Nidre." These new lyrics, not in Aramaic but in Hebrew, are more in the spirit of repentance. It's more of a prayer, less of a cold legal formula. Translation: all the vows of the children of Israel that they are vowing to you, our Father, as they lift their eyes to you who dwell in the heavens, to return to you with all their hearts and all their souls. But it's the same music. Lewandowski could save time and effort by recycling the traditional version. Oops, did we not play that one? There it is. Israel asher hemo noderecha avinu. Okay, now the next one. This inscription reads, "For the new synagogue in Berlin, arranged after the melody of Kol Nidre." These lyrics are in German. O Tag des Herrn, du nahst und das Herz erbebt und Schauer fasset die Seele. O day of the Lord, you draw close and the heart trembles and shivers, seize the soul. But once again, the same traditional music. O Tag des Herrn, du nahst und das Herz erbebt und Schauer fasset die Seele. And this inscription reads, "For the Reformed Jewish community in Nuremberg and Zetten, arranged after the melody of Kol Nidre." These lyrics are also in German, but in this case, a translation of Psalm 130. Aus tiefen ruf ich dich, O ewige Herr. Out of the depths I call unto thee, O Lord. In Hebrew, it's mima'amakim karaticha Adonai. And again, the same traditional music. We're going to listen now to a recording actually made in 1929 by the Jews of Berlin's Reform community. I get chills every time I listen to this, thinking of those Jews in 1929 in Berlin and what was awaiting them just a few years later. Well, now I'd like to take you out of the synagogue and into the concert hall. In 1826, the Jewish community of Vienna was preparing to dedicate its majestic new synagogue on Seitenstetten Street. And a beautiful synagogue it is. This actually survived World War II because it was in a neighborhood that many non-Jews lived. It was not bombed. And today it looks pretty much the way it did in the 19th century. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous building. You can visit it. So these Jews in Vienna asked the great Ludwig van Beethoven if he would compose a cantata for the occasion of the inauguration of the new synagogue. We know that Beethoven was seriously considering accepting the commission, but he eventually turned it down. Keep in mind that Beethoven was deaf, and so in order to have a conversation with him, and this is like in the last year of his life, he was totally deaf. In order to have a conversation with him, you had to write down what you wanted to say in a little notebook that he kept, and then he would read it, and then he could respond. And these notebooks were kept, and so we have the record of the conversations that he had. It's interesting to speculate whether that connection with the Jewish community might have had anything to do with the appearance of this melody in Beethoven's String Quartet in C-sharp minor, Opus 131, composed that same year, 1826, just months before the composer's death. Coincidence? Maybe. Around the same time that Lewandowski published his various arrangements of Kol Nidre in Berlin, a non-Jewish composer turned to the Kol Nidre melody. The German composer Max Bruch was attracted to many exotic musics. In his travels, he often sought out the locals and notated their folk songs. Based on his collections, he composed a Scottish fantasy in 1880, a Celtic adagio in 1891, a Russian suite in 1905, Swedish dances in 1892, as well as numerous arrangements of Irish and Scottish folk songs. In Berlin, Bruch made the acquaintance of Jakob Lichtenstein, who served as cantor at the great Oranienburger Strasse synagogue, where Louis Lewandowski served as composer and choirmaster. Bruch transcribed Lewandowski's and Lichtenstein's version of the Kol Nidre, and in 1881, Bruch completed a fantasy for cello and orchestra, which he called Kol Nidre. Let's listen to an excerpt played by the Vienna Philharmonic Women's Orchestra. Theodora Miteva is the cellist. I encourage you to listen to the whole work. It's really beautiful. You can find many excellent versions wherever you get your music from. Next, we come to the case of the composer Arnold Schoenberg. Have any of you heard of Arnold Schoenberg? I see some heads nodding up and down. That's great. Born in 1874 in Vienna, Schoenberg would become one of the most significant and one of the most controversial composers of the 20th century. Listen. What do you think? Probably not a bestseller, right? This was Schoenberg's system that he called 12-tone composition, a system that would ensure that his music would have no tonality, zero musical gravity. It was modern, perhaps the musical equivalent of abstract art, nothing you can recognize. The academic musical establishment loved it, but it did not sell too many tickets. And in Schoenberg's Vienna, the Nazis hated it. Not only because it was modern, but also, of course, because Schoenberg was a Jew. Indeed, Schoenberg was a passionate Jew, religiously, culturally, and nationalistically. And by the way, when I studied Schoenberg in college, there was nothing in the textbook about his being a Jew, let alone a very involved Jew and a Zionist. But get this, at the age of 23, Schoenberg left the Jewish religion to become a Protestant. But at the same time, he still considered himself a Jew. 25 years after he left Judaism, he wrote a play called The Path of the Bible, the Biblische Weg, about the establishment of a modern Jewish state in the ancient Holy Land. That was in 1923. And the Germans and the Austrians certainly considered him a Jew. That same year, 1923, he wrote, "I have at last learned the lesson that has been forced upon me during this year, and I shall not ever forget it. It is that I am not a German, not a European, perhaps scarcely even a human being, but I am a Jew. But what is anti-Semitism to lead to, if not to acts of violence? Is it so difficult to imagine that? You're perhaps satisfied with depriving Jews of their civil rights? Then certainly Einstein, Mahler, and I, and many others will have been got rid of. But one thing is certain, they will not be able to exterminate those much tougher elements, thanks to whose endurance Jewry has maintained itself unaided against the whole of mankind for 20 centuries." He wrote this 10 years before the Nazis came to power. He saw what was coming. And 10 years later, in 1933, at the age of 59, he felt compelled to abandon his flirtation with Christianity, and he decided to do it in a very public way. In Paris, with Rabbi Louis Germain Lévy officiating, and who was a witness? The artist Marc Chagall. Now, halachically, according to Jewish law, this was not necessary, but Schoenberg wanted the world to know. After this ceremony, he emigrated to the United States, living first in this building in Brookline, Massachusetts, just a few miles from where I am right now. In that same year, 1933, Schoenberg began writing an essay proposing the immediate financing of an independent state for Jewish refugees, and in which he foresaw the Holocaust, warning that unless something were done, 7 million Jews would be murdered. This is in 1933. Schoenberg eventually settled in Los Angeles with many of his other compatriot German Jewish composer emigres. The weather in Massachusetts was too cold for him. 5 years later, in 1938, Schoenberg marked his return to Judaism with a powerful musical composition. Schoenberg had read someplace that Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity had secretly used Kol Nidre as a way to renounce the vow of conversion and assert their eternal allegiance to Judaism. And think about this in Schoenberg's own personal history. He writes a letter to Paul Dessau. I was convinced that the Kol Nidre comes from Spain. It later came out that I was right, although in fact Schoenberg was wrong, but okay. This made it clear to me that the meaning was simply as follows. All those who had willingly or unwillingly apparently gone over to Christianity, and who therefore were supposedly excluded from the Jewish community, might on this day once more become reconciled with their God. And clearly, Schoenberg was thinking of his own going over to Christianity and his subsequent reconciliation with his God and his Judaism. Schoenberg turned to Rabbi Jacob Sonderling, a fellow German emigre, who was the founder and the rabbi of the Society for Jewish Culture Fairfax Temple in Los Angeles. Working with Rabbi Sonderling, Schoenberg created his own text for his Kol Nidre, but he was wary of using the traditional melody. Here's what he wrote. I selected the phrases which a number of versions have in common and put them together in a reasonable order. One of my principal tasks was to vitriolize away the cello sentimentality of the bruchs, etc., and to give this decree, all caps, the dignity of a law, of an edict. I think I have succeeded in this. Well, what do you think he meant by that? To vitriolize means to burn with sulfuric acid. Bruch's Kol Nidre was too sweet, too sentimental for Schoenberg. He wanted to burn that away and create something more savory, more reflective of the gravitas of the liturgical text. Schoenberg does utilize and manipulate several of the Kol Nidre motifs. If you listen carefully, you can hear fragments of the traditional phrases, but in other places he composes freely, using music like a movie soundtrack to underline the drama of the text. Don't think of this as a liturgical piece. Listen to it as dramatic and spiritual concert music. It begins with a mystical soundscape, otherworldly. We can almost picture it as a cinematic soundtrack. In fact, for Schoenberg, it represented the birth of the universe. This is how Schoenberg begins his Kol Nidre. The words that you will see on screen are Schoenberg's, but based on the liturgy and on Kabbalistic themes. It's very soft. The next excerpt is where the Kol Nidre melody first shows up, played by the woodwinds, but almost buried by the other instruments. You have to listen carefully. Notice how different this sounds from the bruch that we heard a few minutes ago. As Schoenberg wrote, he wanted to avoid any sentimentality. Let's hear first a reminder of the melody, then we'll hear it in Schoenberg's music. Kol Nidre ve'asarei v'charamei v'konamei.
All vows, oaths, promises, and plights of any kind, wherewith we pledged ourselves counter to our faith in God, who is one, everlasting, unseen, unfathomable. We declare these null and void.
Now here's how Schoenberg incorporates another phrase. Remember this phrase? Shevikin, Shevitin. Now let's hear it in Schoenberg's composition. Did you hear it? As I said, it's kind of buried with the orchestration. Then Schoenberg introduces the choir and he has them sing his own English language interpretation of the Aramaic text. This is clearly personal. He's relating it to the nullification of his youthful vow to leave the Jewish faith. And now here's the dramatic ending of Schoenberg's Kol Nidre.
We give him leave to be one with us in prayer tonight. A very personal work, autobiographical, you might say, inspired by Kol Nidre. Schoenberg was an intense dude, and his music is very intense. But you should listen to the whole piece. It's only about 11 minutes long. There are many recordings. You can find them on the web, but listen to the version with a full orchestra. There is a video version with just an organ arrangement, which definitely does not do it. All right, finally, let's go to Hollywood. In 1927, Warner Brothers released the first major motion picture with a synchronized soundtrack. It was called, and there it is, The Jazz Singer. As many of you know, the film was about the conflicts between generations, between the newly arrived immigrants who held on to ancestral traditions and their children who wanted to reject them and become real Americans, between traditional religion and secularism. It's the story of Jacob Rabinowitz, who rejects his father, the cantor, and leaves the Lower East Side to make it as a star on Broadway. But in the end, he cannot stay away from his family and from his tradition. On Yom Kippur Eve, he respects his dying father's last wishes, returns to the synagogue to fill in for his father and lead the services. As his girlfriend observes, Jacob is a jazz singer singing to his God. So here is how the jazz singer, played by Al Jolson, sings Kol Nidre. It's the doctor. Extraordinary performance, even if they kind of mangle the words. From its origins in the Talmud as a legalistic loophole, its insertion into the liturgy of Yom Kippur, its rejection and tenacity, its awesome Ashkenazic melody, as well as many other Jewish traditions, its various harmonizations and alterations of the lyrics, the various concert works that it has inspired, there is something about Kol Nidre. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking us on that adventure, getting us all ready for this coming weekend. I've opened up the chat. Please feel free to share your questions. Here's a few that have come in. So, or a few notes and questions. A few notes for me. Number one is I actually went to Princeton University with Randy Schoenberg. He and I hung out together at the Hillel. He's a year ahead of me. And so I remember all the kids making fun of his grandfather's music, that we couldn't listen to it. But it turns out I do talk to Randy now and then. And Randy's going to be with CSP in October talking about a new movie that he was involved in. So if you want to hear from Randy, and you can ask him questions about his grandfather in that context, it'll be coming up in October. Number two.
I actually conducted the Schoenberg's Kol Nidre in Boston, and it was apparently a New England premiere. It had never been done before. It was the early 1970s, which was a real privilege.
He definitely follows his grandfather's music. I know that about Randy. He's also pretty famous for winning a case, and there was a movie made about him called The Woman in Gold. There's a question about when you sing. So you and I were discussing before the program that you are Chazan for hire for the high holidays. And so I know from my wife, of course, I never knew this. There's all different settings, even like of Kol Nidre. I mean, you went through some of them there, but contemporary settings. So which ones do you choose? And do you choose different settings for each of the 3 repetitions of the Kol Nidre that you do?
Yeah, good question. So I sing without any choir and without any instruments. So basically I'm using the traditional motifs. And basically it's the same way 3 times, but one tries to get a little bit more intense, perhaps a little bit louder in each of the repetitions, so it doesn't just sound like we're getting tired of hearing that same thing over and over again.
I know Arshel, my wife, has a choir, and so she has different. She uses if you listen, you will hear there are different settings, and she ends with a Hasidic version. So those of you at B'nai Israel, listen. In your litany of including different versions of Kol Nidre, you neglected something that I found recently in an article about the top 150 Jewish songs of all time that we'll be doing a program on coming up in December. But it's an album that came out in 1968 by a group called the Electric Prunes. The title is Release of an Oath, and they have a Kol Nidre on there. So I'll be sending that to everybody after the program, including you, and it's worth listening to.
I remember that group. You don't forget a name like the Electric Prunes.
I've never heard of them in my life, but I wasn't 68. I was very young. Another story I wanted to share for those of you who read the autobiography of one of the owners of Russ and Daughters in the Lower East Side. It gets very crowded before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because everybody wants to get in there, and just there's lines out the door to get their fish and their lox and their bagels and their cream cheese. And one day there was someone in there and they had to skip the line, and people got very irate. They called the owner in, and he said to the person, "You can't skip the line." But he noticed that the person had a cello, and the person said, "I have to get my food because I have to run to my rehearsal." So he said, "I'll make you a deal. If you can play that cello version that you shared with us of Kol Nidre right here, right now, you can skip the line." And the person pulled out the cello and played it in there, and everybody cried, and he got to skip the line. So that I have to find that story, but I thought that was a great story.
I got to remember that next time I'm standing in line someplace.
Yeah, maybe you could sing. I don't know. I think if you played the cello, that's it. Yeah. There was a question. Why did Schoenberg think that the origin of music was Spain? Did he have any basis for that, or was it just like a hopeful thing?
Oh, no, it's published. It was something that people believed back in the early part of the 20th century. It was later found out to be not the case. But I'm sure he read it someplace, and he wasn't making it up out of thin air.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see if we can find something about that. We have someone in the audience, by the way, whose cousin was in the Electric Prunes. So really, I went from never hearing about this group in my life to having it. I have something I put together for CSP. It's called Contemporary Songs You Can Listen to get you in the mode of the high holidays. And I've got some very unusual ones in there. There's one. Other questions? I'm looking on the list here. There's a lot of thank yous. A lot of people appreciate. I assume no one's really used the Schoenberg's version in the synagogue because it would be too unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was performed once in a version which you can see on the web with just organ instead of the orchestra. But it's it's not practical. I mean, it's certainly, it calls for a huge orchestra, the choir, and the speaker, and it would not really work as a liturgical piece. But as a concert piece, I think it's stunning. And look, I often have some of my most religious experiences in concert, listening to great music of Mahler, Beethoven, or Schoenberg, or whatever. So I think we can have religious experiences in the concert hall as well.
You believe that Beethoven was influenced in that piece that you shared with us?
Well, look, there's no proof one way or the other. We know that, as I said, we know that he was requested to write a piece for the synagogue. And we know that people brought him some Jewish themes that he might be able to use, and then he turned them down. Now, there's no proof that that is the Kol Nidre melody in that string quartet. But if you listen to it, it just sounds so telling, so reminiscent of the opening of the Kol Nidre. And maybe I just want to believe it, and so I believe it.
I want to believe it as well. So we're going to just make it so today.
Yeah.
Beethoven and the Jews. Phyllis Gilmore, her husband who passed away, and we think of him with fond memories from CSP, was a contemporary specialist in music, and he wrote many contemporary pieces. She said this is fantastic. So I have to say, Phyllis, this is a good one to think about Barney on. Rosa Berman said it was great to hear the Sephardic melodies. Most of us have never heard that, and it was interesting to hear the differences between the different parts of the Sephardi world that you shared. There's a question, when you took apart the themes that are in Kol Nidre and you showed how they reappear in other parts of the service, I want to make sure I understand. Are you basically showing us that Kol Nidre came first, and then people picked the themes out of Kol Nidre and then started to apply it to different parts of the services? Or do you think the different musical traditions came together in Kol Nidre later?
We don't really know, but these melodies are referred to by contemporary cantors, or have been referred to for the last 100 years or so, as Misinai melodies. I'm using air quotes here, as if they were handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. They are so traditional. So it's something even stronger than the concept of nusach. These melodies that are linked to certain texts of certain prayers and certain holidays of the year. So we think that these motifs, the came about around that same time. Maybe 200-300 years ago. We really don't know for sure because nothing was written down before then. But it's probable that these came around the same time. Maybe there's somebody who's done a more detailed study about this, but I don't know if there's any way to really know whether the cantors who sang Kol Nidre decided to interpolate some of the motifs from the Mariv service into Kol Nidre, or the other way around. Probably the first way, which is I think what you had suggested, Ari, that these were motifs that everybody was already associating with Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and so they made their way into part of Kol Nidre. But Kol Nidre is almost symphonic. It is so complex. It's not just one tune. It's a series of tunes or motifs that are woven together to create this amazing composition.
Bernard asks if you have a favorite recording from the golden age of cantors of Kol Nidre. I mean, you shared Moshe Oisha, right? The first one.
I love the Oisha recording. There are many others. I didn't find many others, but I have to say, when I was looking around and I heard Cantor Buckdahl, she was terrific, and I'm sure Ari, your wife is amazingly equally amazing, but the way she does it with that gentleness as well as the drama, it makes me want to go to that shul.
Yeah, well, people have pointed out that she is actually the rabbi of the shul. She's the first, I think she was the first Asian American cantor, and then she became the first Asian American rabbi. So
Yeah.
I'd have to, you can tune in to, they have all their services online if you want to
Right.
hear. But interesting
Right.
to see this year, or you can look last year, how they did Kol Nidre, whether she was involved in it. They have incredible music there.
Yeah.
People asked about the language of Kol Nidre, Hebrew, Aramaic, both.
Mhm.
That should
It,
give us a hint as to when it was written as well, correct?
well, not really. It's mostly Aramaic. And remember, it's reflecting a language that was expressed in the Talmud. And then we saw how the early reformers, as we saw in Lewandowski's music, wrote translation. There was a translation into Hebrew, not even a translation, but a kind of a rewording using some of the words, and rewrote it in Hebrew and then in German. No, but the language is overall Aramaic. There are a number of prayers, of course, that are in Aramaic. The most well-known, of course, is the Kaddish, which is mostly in Aramaic.
Thank you. Marjorie says about Schoenberg, it sounds just as sentimental and as the other version. So that was that's
Don't
her
tell his
perspective. And people
grandson.
agreed. I'll tell Randy. I have to give him a call. Okay, what else? And I think we're in overtime here. I'm looking to see if anything else we want to get to. People have asked, yes, we recorded today's session. It'll be made available privately on a private link to those who attended, so you can listen to it again and enjoy. I will share a playlist of some of the music that you've heard. You will definitely get the Electric Prunes version of Kol Nidre. You may have to get into a room with a red light or something to enjoy that one. And we'll include, a lot of people have asked about the references to the Schoenberg piece that you shared with us. So I will share what I can, and I'll do it as soon as possible. So you do not, this would make no sense to get this after Yom Kippur. So within the next 24 hours, you will get this recording and follow-up. I wanted to thank you, Dr. Jacobson, for being with us again. Another great CSP program. It's really great to learn about the music that we hear in the show, but don't know as much about as we'd like. So now we know way more about Kol Nidre.
Thank you, Ari. And may I wish the 234 people here a Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, and may the coming year be a good one. We have a lot to worry about in the coming year. Let's focus on the good parts and pray for good.
Gemar Chatima Tova to all of you. Nice seeing everybody. Have a great day. See you soon.
Thanks all.
Take care. Bye-bye.